Thank you for coming back to Arguing Agile. It's the only podcast on the old interwebs where a product owner and Agile coach yell at each other until a fist fight happens, or occasionally a knife fight, and then we hug it out and have a drink.
That's okay, as long as we agree to have a drink.
So what I thought that we'd argue about today is estimation, because in the spirit of the last episode, where I took something that was discussed way too much, or maybe the next episode. I don't really know what order these are going to be. I figured we would do a whole show on estimation.
Right, estimation. Wow.
I don't want to. I'm being held hostage. Blink 3 times if you don't want to talk about estimation.
But it's such a great subject.
What makes estimation such a great subject?
I think people feel compelled to actually do something about the massive work that they have in front of them. I mean, think about the ancient Egyptians when they built the pyramids. Do you think they estimated how long, how many stones? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, let's talk about pyramid conspiracy theories. I think they had a Gantt chart, and they had
somebody said we're gonna get this done by 2000 BC or whatever.
They had utilization. This is a multi-generational effort here.
Yeah.
So they definitely had a Gantt chart for that, and all their deadlines were wrong. And somebody was literally asking, will this be done in my lifetime?
Many somebody's
Quite
asked
literally.
that, I'm sure. So estimation, I mean, it is an activity that's fairly commonly done. But the question we should be asking is why? Why do we bother doing estimation? I think it's endemic that every project has one question that's asked without doubt. When are we going to be done? Right?
If you ever watched the Agile podcast before, you know that those are my 2 questions that I say that any incompetent leadership representative can walk into the room and ask to feel like they're in charge. They can say, when's it going to be done? Is it going to, or more the more experienced professionals, these are professionals. I shouldn't be saying it like that. These are professionals. The more professional of the professionals will say, is it going to be done by? And they'll just give you a random date out of the air. Or my personal favorite is, when's it going to be done? And then regardless of what you say, cut that in half and say, really?
Dude, you've been dealing with some professionals.
They are.
My experience has been a little bit less, what's the word?
Savory?
So yeah. My experience has been, they'll come in and say, here's a project. We don't really know what that's about. That's the underlying
But
tone.
it needs to be done
by.
It
needs to be done by September 18th, 2 p.m. almost. So this is why a lot of teams say, well, let's go ahead and start estimating the work. But when you think about it, those 2 things aren't even connected. They're not on the same physical dimension, really, or metaphysical dimension. You take a date and you go, finish it by this date.
Yeah.
But the it isn't even understood at that point. And the team doesn't know what it's going to take to make this it happen, right?
Well, sometimes here, let's argue for a second. Sometimes there are real deadlines. Like, I guess before we get into any of the minutia of how, into any of the how to estimate, sometimes there are real deadlines, like the
regulatory ones.
German data protection,
GDPR.
Yeah. That's a real deadline. The law goes into effect. You have to be compliant by X date or whatever. And there are other, the tax ones are famous for real deadlines. The law goes into effect on a certain date, or your marketing materials out telling your customers when your launch is, or when your service is live or whatever. Right. That becomes a real date because you basically made a commitment to customers. And at that point, you can make you can do the dance with scope, and you can do the dance with quality, some other things, I'm sure, that you really shouldn't do, but people do. However, sometimes there are real dates.
Undoubtedly.
Sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes. And it should not be a surprise, typically, right? When there's a real date, people should understand why that date is what it is. It's a compliance requirement, regulatory requirement, etc., right? Those are real dates.
Yeah.
So what causes a team want to estimate the work ahead of them? And it's really, it all comes down to answering that question, when will we be done?
Yeah.
But then the underlying assumption is what needs to be done in its entirety, because you can't estimate, right, if you only know partially what needs to be done. And that's where the disconnect happens quite often. Early on in the project, you don't really know as much. There's more uncertainty, but that's when the answer is demanded, like to the day, right? And You're
Yeah.
damned if you say a date because you can't walk it back.
Yeah, well, that's a rookie mistake. But first of all, estimation suggestions. Don't make rookie mistakes. And rookie mistakes is being the first one to give a date, you lose. Like that's all right. Well, thanks for coming to the podcast. Like that, that's your tidbit. But for me, for a product owner or product manager, why do estimates? So that I can forecast to the business when I expect certain things to be done inside of a reasonable window. I will say I am not gonna. I luckily have the experience to know to never give a hard date. Okay, and if I give a time frame, it will usually be able to be flexed by a sprint or two. If I give a time frame, and we're talking out in the future time frame, we're not talking about like something that we're working on that we've been working on for 2 sprints that the end is near next sprint. In that case, I'll be like, it looks like the end is going to be next sprint, maybe another sprint depending on other things that we find that crop up. And that assumes that the scope doesn't change,
Right.
that we don't discover anything else, or I don't decide, because again, I'm taking ownership of the schedule at that point. I don't decide that something else is more important. Right. And if I do decide something else is more important, then again, as a product manager, my job is to shop around to the stakeholders to say, hey, I decided this other thing is more important. Don't you agree that it's more important to the business? And now I have a job to do on behalf of my team so I don't make the team look bad. I could completely see not doing that job so that the don't shoot the messenger kind of thing, where it's like, I don't want to deliver the bad news. So I'm going to send one of my developers or the Scrum Master or somebody else to deliver the bad news, and then I'm not. And then when they come to me and be like, Brian, why has your team missed the date? I can be like, oh, these developers, they don't do anything. They're so slow. Yeah. They can never hit my dates. Oh my goodness! Like I'm somehow not part of that in any way, shape, or form. But I see that all the time.
Me too. I've seen that way too often, and unfortunately, the consequences thereof are: if these developers aren't cutting it, we'll get new ones. Not that that's going to solve your problem necessarily, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So just to go back to that, you're right. It's to be able to forecast to the business some sort of time frame, but also it's to be able to forecast maybe to your customers if you've got your marketing stuff out there, or if you're under competitive pressure. You can't be late to market compared to your competition. So there are other pressures that lead you to be able to forecast. So that's the key word there. To be able to forecast, you have to know how you're going to chunk out the work, and therefore when's it going to be done. And then the trade-offs, etc., those discussions can ensue after that.
Now, there is a camp that I have observed on, it's the same camp we talked about last episode of incendiary posts on LinkedIn in order to get attention, that will say, like, it's just guesses. Like, just call them guesses. And if you don't like hearing the word guess, then maybe you shouldn't be going through any of these strategies to try to come up with even forecasts, they would probably quibble about, like, well, it's just a forecast, it's just a guess. Like, sure, it's a guess, but like when you say guess, that means, to me, that means you have no evidence behind it.
Right.
That's what guess means to me. That's like the difference between a gamble and a risk. You know what I mean? Where like in a risk, I can still back out and I'll still have something. In a gamble, if it doesn't go my way, I lose everything and I don't have anything anymore. A forecast and a guess are completely separate things. Based on historical, I think this is what tomorrow's weather looks like.
Right.
As opposed to, I'm going to take a jacket.
Just in case?
Just in case it rains.
Yeah.
I don't really know, but I'll have the jacket anyway. Yep. You know?
Yeah, so in the world of finance, they do this a lot, right? So they'll put out a forecast, a financial forecast. They call that a forward-looking statement that says, we're expecting XYZ, right, this quarter. And there's really not a whole lot of science behind it except for what happened in the past. So there's historical evidence of what happened in the past. And then what they do is take those data points and extrapolate forward, saying if everything stays the same, or we'll allow for certain things, interest rates may go up. So therefore, we're going to just moderate our forecast accordingly to the extent we can and say, this is what we expect. But it's an actual number, right? And that's what happens with development teams as well. When they forecast, they will say, unfortunately, they will say, we will be done in sprint 25 or somewhere between 23 and 27, something like that. I'd say two things there. First of all, I'd underline that sentiment. Never give an actual date. Always give a range. But the range will vary based on how far in the future it is. Because the further, obviously, everyone knows this, the further out it is, the less certain you are. So if you're only, 15 sprints out, you could say it's going to be delivered somewhere between sprint 13 and 16 or 18 or whatever. That's okay. But if you've got 50 sprints, you wouldn't be doing that. You wouldn't be saying it's 48 to 52. That range is too narrow. You'd be saying it might be Q4 of 2024 or whatever, right? So it gets fuzzier the further out you go. And if it doesn't, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're setting yourself up, basically.
What you were describing, forecast, that is an outcome of prioritization. It's taking historical evidence, adding prioritization, and now you're releasing a plan. That's right. All it is. Again, people that kind of say, well, it's just a guess. Calm down. You don't need to attract my viewership on LinkedIn. It's cool. Like, the real discussion, though, is it's some sort of evidence-based conclusion versus a true guess, which is someone walking in the room and be like, you need to be done by June 1st.
Right.
I have no
Finger
idea.
in the air.
I have no idea what the scope is. I have no idea what the projects you're working on. I have no idea what you do, it's team size, any of that kind of stuff. But I'm going to pick a date out of the air. And none of this is even on our agenda, which is exciting because I feel like we're talking about something real now, which is I enjoy shopping for cars. I'm going to bring this example up now because there's a tactic in car shopping where the person who throws out the first price is the loser. But there's also the tactic that the person who throws out the first price is the winner because it's called rejection, then retreat. So I'm like, hey, Om, let me borrow $100. And you're like, get out of here. I didn't got $100. I'll be like, cool, let me borrow $20.
Right.
And you're like, oh, I got $20. Wait a minute. Why am I giving you $20? Like, so the car dealership thing is if I throw out the first number, I just kind of expose, and now I'm never going to get higher than my number, so I shouldn't throw out the first number. I think that's garbage because the hack to the psychology here is the person who throws out the first number, it is a tactic to win because if you throw out the first number and the first number is wildly over what is acceptable and the person bargains for whatever, half of that number, maybe you always wanted half of that number. Maybe that was your real number. And now you've gotten them to, well, they got a great deal. They cut what they were asking for in half. They got 50% off.
Right.
As soon as I heard that as like the name of that tactic, I was like, well, I see this used all the time in estimation. You guys need to launch this by March 31st. Like, holy cow, March 31st is only like 6 weeks away.
Do it by April then.
Okay.
April 31st.
Yeah, do it by April. Oh, my goodness. So it's 6 weeks. Oh, that's 10 weeks. That's almost twice as much time. We can do that. But how do you know? You're just picking arbitrary dates.
You are. You have no basis.
None of that's based on a forecast.
That's right. That's right.
So, I mean, really, you should be spending your time to establish a historical, and then from the historical, look forward with a forecast based on that historical, and assuming your backlog and everything is kind of run out, that you can do what I'm talking about. If you don't have a backlog, you don't have things estimated and stuff like that, then you need to stop and do that or spend more time doing that and then worry about having this conversation of picking dates out of the air. I only bring that up because almost every work center I've been in had some element of somebody picking a date out of the air, right? Either because they just wanted something and the development team was like, they just were impatient and didn't want to deal with the normal forecasting process, or they were one of these PMO types that were like, tell me what it's going to take to complete this project that a year from now, which is just well beyond what it would be informative or useful to forecast.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is one other thing that I'm sure the PMP people will understand. If you don't have a track record to even base anything on, the only other thing you could do is what's known as analogous estimation. Was there a project like that done recently that's very similar in nature? And you'd still have to modify, your estimate based on the fact that this is different or to the degree it's different. But yeah, you could do that, right? Chances are, because every project is unique, there isn't one exactly like that. There might be one that's close.
Yeah, close.
So there is that. But yes, short of that, you really need to establish a cadence. And there's assumptions that are built into that. The history you've established that you're basing your forecast on impinges on a team that has established that history. So the assumption is that team's going to be kept intact going forward, so they can deliver to a cadence, right?
That's a big assumption.
It's a huge assumption because in my experience, unfortunately, that has not proven to be the case.
No.
Unfortunately. So the team keeps going, forming, storming, right? It just keeps slipping down, right? Unfortunately. But yeah, so I think where we're going with this is estimation is very commonplace out there, right? There are ways to do this. There are ways to frame things with leadership teams. Don't give an actual date, those sorts of things. Give a range and so on and so forth. But then how do the teams do this?
Yeah. The how of this discussion. So I think most of this should be familiar to people that are practicing in the field. So let's hit the most decisive one first. And I'm going to have a tough time with this one because I have very, very strong feelings about using hours to estimate. So estimating based on time.
Yeah, estimating based on time is fraught with danger. I mean, look, it's the first base layer or layers of the pyramid took a lot less time than the ones further up, right? So you couldn't say, well, the first one took, I don't know, 10 years. So now everything else is going to be a multiple of 10. How many layers do you want? Estimation in hours is a fallacy because it's not linear. So you're going to say it's going to take us a month to do this and then another month to do this. There's huge assumptions there, right? So estimation in hours is something that is the oldest estimation technique when it comes to software development because it goes back to the old project management days when people used to say, well, how many hours will it take or how many weeks or how many months? And it just gets broken down that way. Matched up against who's available for how long per day sort of thing, right?
Well, so the counterpoint to this, which I guess I'll take the counterpoint, whatever. Like, why do I got to take the counterpoint to this? The counterpoint to this
you do it well.
Well, it's the one that I have a discussion every time with somebody I want to have on the podcast. I have a lot of respect for, so and I definitely listen to their opinion when they tell me. The thing about hours is everyone understands hours. There's no ambiguity when you communicate hours in your forecast, basically, if you're forecasting in hours. And while, yes, it's widely believed to be, and I've not checked any facts before this statement, but I would, if I had to put money on, I would put money on it is the most inaccurate out of all of the methods that we're about to discuss, estimating in hours or estimating in time. But it translates the easiest up through management. And I think you started going down that road of, well, it translates the easiest because this is what everyone learns in their MBA classes, and this is what the people that run companies, they clearly understand this above everything else we're about to talk about. They clearly, in their head, they can conceptualize this and clearly understand it. If you tell me it takes 800 hours to make this software change and to properly test it between all my team members, I understand what 800 hours means. It's X number of weeks or whatever. It's 20 weeks, I guess, if you had streamlined, but if you have multiple people, it's probably less time than that. I can do my little work breakdown and figure out what work needs to start between other work and figure out how many people, if I want to cut that down to, I want the whole project to take 1 month. Let me cut that 800 hours into 2 weeks of this and 1 week of this or whatever, and it makes sense to me as the executive whose education is based off of something that came out of factory work and something that came out of like each job should take exactly this many minutes performed by this person, and that scales to this. If I want to carry this much ore to my freight cars per day, I've got to have this many steps and this much utilization.
Right.
That is the counterpoint to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So the linearity is built in and assumed here, right?
Yes.
And the other thing that's assumed is how you're going to build the entire product. You may not know in reality, but you assume you're going to know. So let's say you're putting together widgets and every widget is the same size. That's an assumption, right? Day one. So you say, well, it takes me 2 hours to put one of these widgets together. So and I have 20 of them. Therefore it is. And you extrapolate that out. Mm-hmm. But what you find in practice is after the second or the third one, you run into some complexities, right? And the fourth one might take you longer. And now your assumptions are invalid. Yeah. So I think we need to talk about, as far as estimation hours is concerned, we're going to talk about what's the end result. The end result shouldn't be precision. We're not trying to predict when the project will be done with precision. We're trying to say it's thereabouts with all of these assumptions, etc., documented. And we say, well, it should be around there, but there are no guarantees, right?
Yeah.
I think the important thing here is don't be one and done with that. Don't say, well, we're going to estimate that at the front of the project and say this is what it is. It's going to take 20 sprints. Evaluate that every sprint and update it. It's sort of like if you take a flight somewhere and you ever had a chance to listen to the pilot communicating with traffic control, you'll see what they do all the time. There's always deviations along the route, but your destination doesn't change necessarily. They may go around certain vectors because there's weather, there's traffic in the air, in the way, or whatever it is. So there's minor adjustments that are made en route, and we need to do the same thing. So if you're estimating in hours and you're incorporating those adjustments and frequently updating your estimate, then there's nothing wrong with estimating in hours. It's as right or wrong as any other method. But people don't do that.
Well, I like my pushback to that one. Like, ooh, now I'm on the other side of hours. My pushback to that is it's fine if it's just your team in a vacuum.
Sure.
But when you plug in to a program and you miss your estimate because somebody promised X number of ideal days or X utilization or whatever, and something happens or some technical thing crops up or somebody gets sick, whatever. Yeah. Or somebody goes on vacation, then the whole house of cards starts coming down because one hourly estimate is missed, and now since you're in that utilization / capacity / hourly estimate world, usually what happens in an hourly, I guess this is a kind of a crappy argument though, because usually in the world where you're doing estimates in hours, you normally have a project manager or somebody cooking the books to get the maximum utilization out of your team in that period of time, and any disruption to that utilization causes everything to derail.
Yeah, they try and encapsulate those disruptions into assumptions and say, nobody gets sick, et cetera, right? You have to assume that because you don't know what you don't know. But you're right. In a program, there's more variables because as soon as you have more than one team, now the variables compound, right? And so that just makes it much, much more difficult for sure.
Yeah, and most experienced project managers will deal with that by building in some sort of padding into their estimates. They'll put some kind of padding in. And when I was at a program that worked in hours, we did that. We put everyone. I used to try to encourage people to give clean estimates without padding, but invariably people would pad their estimates because that's just it ends up being the culture. People would pad their estimates. But I did want to point out something that you brought up, which was the program that I worked on where we estimated in hours. We tracked the estimate, the first estimate that the developers threw out when they were in their refinements or whatever. But then we tracked the actuals on the work item with each other. So you would have this is what we originally thought it would be. This is what it ended up being. You'd have those side by side. So that was very nice because at least you could look back at the end of the sprint and say, we estimated this would be 60 hours of work and it ended up being 95 hours of work. Somehow we finished in a 2-week sprint. Don't ask how.
Nobody's left alive anymore, but yes.
And then the diff is plus minus whatever, plus 30% or whatever. So we know next sprint. We have an idea of forecast. We know next sprint we should plan for 25-ish, 28, 30% less capacity inside of or we need to plan for more timing, or maybe some things happen. We need to talk about who is out or adding a team member, whatever happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So adding a team member. So that's the problem with straight line projections and extrapolations is people could look at that and say, oh, it looks like we had people out. Let's just add a person, right? And automatically they think that it's going to go back. The deviation is going to go back to the projected line. And it doesn't happen that way because people are people. They're not machines or robots. But it's just all too easy to fall in that trap. So if you're mindful of that, you're as likely to get it wrong as you are right. And I agree with your sentiment there. If you're estimating in hours, vaya con Dios.
Yeah. What about people who try to play games with the hourly estimates, like ideal days or actual days, or like people try to play with they're all different concepts. So the typical one I see is they will utilize their developers at like 6 hours a day, and they'll try to do it like that, or they'll say like, oh, people do this as well. We're going to get into story points later, but I'm dealing with it now because some shops that I've seen try to say a story point is the equivalent of a half day, and then 2 points the equivalent of 2 days. You know, they'll try to equivocate story points to hours to equal like, well, 1 point is 4 hours, and 2 points is 8 hours, and 3 points is 16 hours or whatever. And they'll try to, basically they're just translating hours or ideal days into points or something like that.
Yeah, and they're ably encouraged by a very large scaling framework to do this, sadly. But before we go down the path of looking at these sorts of concepts like ideal days and so on, to your point about padding, right? So I think the preferred term is buffer. But they do. But that is a reality. People will always err on the side of safety and say, well, I think it's going to take me 4 hours. I'm going to say 6, just in case, because I don't know what I don't know. So there's that uncertainty. And it's now crept in at a much lower level. So what happens if you add up all of that is huge gross magnification of that delta. That's part of the problem. Ideal days and actual days. So everybody understands actual days, that they're just calendar days. Ideal days vary per team, or they should vary per team. So this one size fits all, 6 hours per day. Again, a huge assumption. There are some team members that can actually pull off an ideal day that is closer to their actual day, because all they are doing every day is heads down development, save a few sprint events here and there.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there are some people that have much lower ideal day hours than actual days, just because of the way they work. Here's a model that fits into that. If you have a team that is swarming, instead of somebody owning a piece of the story or whatever it is, right, a task, it belongs to the team, so they will pitch in wherever they can, lend a hand. They'll help a tester out towards the end of the sprint because they're back-ending testers. In those scenarios, it's very difficult to say an ideal day is 6 hours. If you're going to do that, you almost have to go down to the next level, which I've never seen done successfully, or even at all, really, which is Bob over here, his ideal day is 7 hours, right? Mary over here, hers is 4 hours because she's swarming and helping others out, doing a bit of documentation, light documentation as well, so it's not straight development.
Yeah.
People don't do that. What they say is they just say, well, it's 6 hours for everybody, and the tooling allows you to tailor it, but there's no basis to do that, right? So people don't. Now you could do it. You could. Is the juice worth the squeeze? I don't know. You could look back at the last X number of sprints and say, but Mary actually managed to average around 7 instead of 4. So going forward, we're going to forecast 7 for her.
Oh boy!
And then what happens, right? I mean, we know what happened in the pandemic. All plans just went belly up. So you've got to be ready for those things too. How much do you put into this? That's the question. And then what's the gain at the end of it?
You know what's
hourly forecast.
What's funny is I did not even have this in any of my agenda items here, but individual versus team forecasting was not on my agenda at all. And like what you just said kind of brought the whole thing up for me. I was like, oh, I completely forgot about that. Why I am pretty adamantly against hourly forecasting, because it ends up turning very quickly into micromanagement. That in everywhere I've ever been that's done hourly forecasting, it turns very quickly into micromanagement. And the fact that you just said that brought up horror stories in my mind. The horror story being, we set our utilization at 6.5 hours per developer or whatever in the sprint. So if there's 10 days in a 2-week sprint and your utilization is 6.5 hours per day, you should have punched in 65 hours at the end of the day on Friday on your last day of the sprint, because obviously our sprints end on Friday because we're terrible people. So if I get a time report from the time tracking system, or if I'm tracking your original estimate on your work items plus the hours that you punched in that say that you've done, I should be able to pull all your items from the sprint that you worked on that are in the sprint, and then look at the amount of time that you say that you spent on them. They should equal 65. And if they're off, now I'm going to pull you into my office, and I need to know why all your work items added together were only 62.3, but 65 was your utilization. So what happened the other whatever hour, hour and whatever minutes? Like, I need to know what happened. At the point where we're quibbling over a couple hours here and there, like, I'm out. Like, what are we doing?
Exactly. We're forgetting the fact that the team members are human beings and not robots.
The other thing that you brought up that I thought I'd point out before we move off of this is in that utilization disguised as capacity environment where I'm talking about right now, there's no room for peer programming.
Dude, there's no room for innovation either, right? Because all you're doing is just cranking out stuff like boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, innovation that's somebody else's job. For the developers screaming into their console right now. Also, refactoring, not encouraged. Fixing things that you see when you see them, not encouraged.
Just keep accumulating that crap.
Stopping what you're doing because you came up with a better way to code your solution and redoing that way. Also, checking in your PR, taking suggestions, rolling them in, not included in this either. So in this, I could easily see pushing back against code reviews and PRs in this culture. I could see the development team members pushing back against that. Absolutely. We don't need code reviews.
We don't.
It's a waste of time.
That's right. Absolutely. And so correspondingly, of course, quality tanks, right? Yeah.
Well, again, in this instance where I'm hourly, I've spent a certain amount of time testing something, and I'm just getting weird results. Now I've blown my original estimate out of the water. Now I'm going to get a visit from my disciplinarian or whatever form my disciplinarian is in. Brian, you give bad estimates. Every time you give an estimate, it's bad.
So what's Brian going to do? Just double them up next time?
No, I'll test what I can, and I'll finish it, and then I'll just pass it out.
Yeah. Churn out crap.
Or I'll constantly get yelled at because I take too much time to test something. But again, at the time that I'm testing it, like, it's too late. Like, I have very little ability to influence the quality of the product by the time I get it to test it. And the fact that I'm getting yelled at for something that I have very little ability to affect,
right?
That's a whole different problem. So, again, hours. I have a lot of problems with hours. I think the worst shops out there do hours. That if you were to tell me that if I was going to an interview and I ask you how you do estimates, which I will ask in an interview.
You should. Take note.
And you tell me hours, I'm done. I'm out. I'm not interested anymore. But I am interested in moving on past hours because I feel like we beat it up enough. So do you want to move on to story points, or do you want to move on to I think story points
is the next most prevalent.
Relative estimating probably is more relevant than hours, I would hope. Yeah. I pray. This is the religious podcast. I pray that relative estimates are more prevalent than people doing hours, but I kind of suspect they're not. So the normal thing that is out there is story points for this.
Right.
Fibonacci story points, or modified Fibonacci, in case you care about copyrights.
I think you're right. Story points are prevalent. However, they're not always done, I don't want to say the word correctly, but properly. And when I say that, what I mean is oftentimes people don't do relative estimating. They just simply look at a story and say, oh, yeah, well, this is much work to do. So it's 4 or 5. Can't have a 4, so it's a 5. Yeah. And the tester is going to go, don't forget, I got to test it. Can we make it an 8?
Yeah, add my testing to it. Add my testing
exactly.
to it.
So that's not relative estimation, folks, right? And that's what I see all the time out there. Just because you're using story points, you're agile, right? Unfortunate. I think people are fooling themselves when they say they're estimating in story points when they're not actually estimating in the right way.
I think it's very easy to push back and argue against story points because every place that I've worked that uses story points, I go through the following discussion. And the discussion goes like this. So this is a 3. So that's going to take me like 3 days to implement, or is that like 3 hours to implement? Or like this is a 5. Is a 5, does it take me twice the amount of time to implement a 3, or is that like a 3 and a 2 combined equals the complexity of a 5? And I go through that every time, and I help them understand it's just relative. Like, just pick something that this work is like, and it's like that, and the scale just moves up. Like, forget the numbers. It could be 1, 2, 3.
Exactly.
It could be T-shirt sizing in disguise of points. It doesn't. I guess relative estimate could also be T-shirt sizing. I guess, but
Sure.
I was like, the point is you compare it to something. So pick your baseline stories, but then you have to keep going back to those baseline stories to refine to make sure that those baseline stories are current, basically. But this is probably out of all these methods that we're about to talk about today, I probably have the most difficult time explaining story points.
Story point, the scale itself, like you said, could be anything, right?
Yeah.
So I often suggest the team use a fruit scale, right? So a blueberry, everybody knows the size of a blueberry. It varies a little, but not a lot. And compare that to a strawberry, right? And then the question I ask is the strawberry bigger or smaller? And most people say it's bigger. And you say, well, is it roughly around twice as big or 3 times as big? Right?
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong answer. If you say 3, fine, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And then I move on to say, okay, well, now you've got a blueberry and a strawberry that's 3 times as big. All right, now look at a kiwi. Is that bigger or smaller than a strawberry?
Yeah.
There's some kiwis are smaller than some strawberries are bigger, but on the whole, right? And then move on to an orange and then to a honeydew melon, whatever. So the scale itself, my point is the scale itself is irrelevant, really. It's relative. So the other way to think about it is, how long does it take for you to wash your car, right? It's a regular 4-door sedan. Let's say it takes you 2 hours to wash your car.
Uh-huh.
And now I'm going to give you a minivan. It's going to take you less time or more time. It's bigger, right? Might take you a little longer. And then you say, well, what about a bus? So relative estimation as a concept is not hard to understand. It's the implementation that people screw up with because they're so fixated on scales. They don't know whether they should be adhering to a true Fibonacci or a modified one or whatever. And that's where teams get into it. And the other thing that teams get into is additive things like, well, for development, it's a 3, and like you said earlier, right? So and when you add testing, it becomes a 5, and they lose sight of the fact that you have to incorporate risk and complexity, right, into it. It's not just the measure. The minute they say, well, a 3 is a 3-day thing, that's when things have already unhinged. Because some 3s might take you 5 days, and some 5s might take you 2 days because of that risk and complexity measure.
Yeah, I'm not, like, the more I work with story points and the more new teams I join with story points and the more I have the same discussion with story points, the less I like story points. I got to be honest. Like, I started this discussion expecting to really, really go hard at hours. But it's real easy to come down on story points too, because everywhere I've worked, I'm very serious. Like, everywhere I worked, I've had to deflect the discussion of it's not just 1 point equals 1 hour or 1 day. And I've had that discussion. I've also had the discussion of, like, they don't necessarily double in value, like the safe model where they double in value as they go up. Like, when they double in value, like, why would safe use Fibonacci at all? Why wouldn't safe just use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in an infinite scale where the points just go up doubling? Like, a 2 is double a 1, a 4 is double a 2, an 8 is double, you know what I mean? Like 16, 32. Like, why not just use that scale if you're truly doubling?
Right.
Just use that scale. Anyway, whatever. Because at least in that instance, everything could double and double forever, and then your features that are containers for your stories would just get the aggregate of all the doubled story points. So your features now have sizes that are weighted. Like, it just seems like it'd be a better way to do it than the way they're doing it now, which is very strange. But like, I completely understand why the safe model tries to standardize the story points between teams, because they're trying to standardize predictability between teams. But again, at that point, now you're just playing the same games you were playing with hours, but with different numbers. So that would be the critique of story points in general, is you're doing the same guessing you're doing with hours, but now you're using a even more nebulous vehicle to carry your guessing forward, basically.
Yeah, and that is absolutely correct in the case where it's not true relative estimation based on risk and complexity, right? As long as you can adhere to that, then I think it could work. But to your point about standardizing across teams, I mean, that's crazy, because you don't have standard people working across 2 teams, right? And otherwise, you'd have robots. So you can't do that.
I mean, maybe I could easily see, if you're in a very large program and you have people that have been there a long time, that start with one team and they move to another as they get more senior organization and they kind of branch out. So like, yes, you do have different people working on every team, but maybe you have enough senior and mid-level people where they kind of proliferate all the teams, and maybe you have community events, community practice, community interest type events where everyone's kind of plugged in and kind of have the same understanding of relation of story points and stuff like that. Maybe they all look back at the same items. Maybe the developers make it a thing when they have their community events to say, these are some of the stories we think are fives. From the perspective of trying to broaden the learning between all the teams, I can see where you could standardize the story points between teams by making it a constant review cycle between all the teams. I don't know how many teams I'm talking about right now. It probably would be like, once it gets to a certain point, it gets kind of silly. So I'm talking about maybe, I don't know, 6 teams, 8 teams, maybe at the most 8 teams. 8 teams, 10 people per team, some management overhead and stuff like that. You're near 100-something people right now. So not more than 12 probably. There's an upper limit to this.
Yeah, I'm sure there is.
Because it's a regular community event. At a certain point, it becomes like the company meeting where you just put them on the screen and make a coffee and do something while the company meeting is going on. Right. Your attention is not required. But I'm talking about the meetings where you actively participate in. So probably not more than 3 teams together.
Right. Yeah, I mean, sure, you could do that, right? But again, the assumption is that it's the same team every time.
Yeah.
Because you have churn and there's just way too many variables here. Story points. Yeah, so they're not applied correctly. If applied correctly, they kind of sort of work, but they're not a panacea necessarily. They're still not an absolute precise way of doing things.
So the more we discuss this, the more I'm moving to the camp against story points at this point, quite honestly. And like every program I've been with uses story points.
Right.
Yeah, pretty much. I don't think I've ever been in an organization that does not use story points and does not use hours, which is going to the last thing we're going to talk about today. I don't think I've ever been in an organization that purely uses flow metrics and stuff like that, just because it's like it's an advanced concept for development centric organizations, and it's also an advanced concept for business focused organizations. Where I'm going with this is I'm trying to build a positive case for story points. What is the best way to utilize story points?
I think the best way really goes back to the basics, which is every sprint, the team as a whole, without influence, decides what a medium is. Well, it doesn't matter. They can say what a small is, right? Sure. And then relative to that, how much is this story going to take, and not time, right? What does this story look like holistically? And considering risk and complexity in the mix, if they can get good at that, then it could work. Sure, it's not precise, but the margin of error equals out over across the stories and across sprints. So that could work. But again, it requires discipline on the part of the team, also the Scrum Master, to kind of facilitate it that way. If they can do that, that might work. It's as good as any of the methods we've discussed so far, probably better, right? But not the best, I would say, right? Flow metrics, to your point, are better, but not very widely used and not very widely understood either. I don't recall very many dev teams say, let's just use those, because they don't understand them. When you explain it to them, most people get it. So then it's getting them off what they're habitually used to, which is hopefully not hours, but story points, and then moving towards flow metrics.
Yeah, I'm convinced that the hashtag NoEstimates movement is just a marketing thing to grab attention, because it's like in like if you strip back the crazy person persona, it's just flow metrics. Like you could take every story that you send through and mark it with a value of 1 story point, and you'd have the exact same thing as hashtag NoEstimates. As
long as you break down your stories to their smallest possible level, then that could work.
I will freely admit, again, it's not an issue where I work, because I am the product owner on the team, and it's only me writing everything. So I have a style, and regardless of what that style is, I'm writing all the stories. So I will tend to break them all down relatively to the same amount, and maybe they flex a little bit up or down, but in the end, basically the flow becomes all the work coming in through the pipeline is of the same size, basically.
That's the key right there. It's
sure
roughly around the same size, and then you could just dispense with all of these measures altogether. Your metric is the number of stories you get over the finish line per unit of time.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, that was the smartest thing I ever encountered in a certification class. Was I had a instructor who he was like, it's a flow is a fluid dynamics concept where the most efficient, fastest way that things flow through a pipe is that all the particles are relatively the same size and small.
Rheology fundamentals. Absolutely. Yes.
And that vision in my head that he planted during that class stuck with me for many, many years because I was like, oh, yeah, it makes total sense to me. Again, it's not a problem for my team because I write almost all the work that comes into my team. So, and usually at the end of a sprint, I will show to my team, this is the burn down as it looks in story points, and this is the burn down as it looks in just the count of stories that we did. And usually, I can't think of a single time for my current team, I haven't been with the team that long, but I do not have a single graph that does not exactly match the trend line when I look at both of those side by side.
So that corroborates the fact that you are breaking stories down
Correct.
as best you can, right? That's the lowest level.
For my team.
For your team.
If you see a difference between those two graphs, maybe some further investigation is necessary. But again, product can make a huge difference with this particular category. The hashtag no estimates, meaning don't estimate, don't spend time estimating. Just consider how many stories flow through your sprint each sprint. And take that number, and that now builds your forecast. That's I just go watch the 45-minute no estimates video, and you don't have to now. I just summed it all up.
Some time.
Yeah, I summed it all up in a 30-second audio clip. Again, the problem there becomes you need product to be engaged. You need product to be driving your backlog refinements, to be driving your stories and breaking them down to a logical segment. I mean, a BA can go very far helping with this kind of stuff. Ideally, you want your product person to have that skill too. That would be very nice. Or I will point out, your Scrum Master / development team to have that skill. The best development teams have a good eye for what needs to be broken down. You know what I mean? What seems like it's too big, and they'll ask to break certain pieces out. Usually what happens is when you're discussing acceptance criteria, when the acceptance criteria grows past a certain point, you'll say, oh, this is becoming a lot. We probably should break out whatever. I had this discussion, I think earlier today, I had this discussion with my team. Might have been today. I don't remember. But we were building something that was going to require a new column in the database, or something like that. And I asked the team, hey, is it important? Because I'm still pretty new, so I don't know about how their definition is done, their concept of database design, stuff like that. I asked, is it important that when a user this is a field that a user can configure, turn on or off. Is it important that we can go keep an audit of when a user turned this function on and off? Because maybe users might complain that like, oh, I didn't see any data for this period of time. Well, now we need to go investigate. In this period of time, did you have the function on or off? And who turned it on and who turned it off? I was like, I'm leaving it to you, the team, because I am too new to the organization to know if strong audit practices and stuff are part of the culture, or if no one has ever asked which user turned this on.
Don't even capture.
Yeah, it's just some cultures they don't care. They would never even care. Software's performing, it's working. Who cares? But other cultures, it's very important to have an audit log. So I added that as a bottom piece of acceptance criteria. And I was like, I completely could see if this is not in place, this bottom piece of AC becomes a completely new story. Enable all this audit logging and that kind of stuff. But I was like, I'll leave it up to you. If you think if you already have a mechanism, then cool. But if you don't have any concept of this, we need to break this out into its own story.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. If they were logging stuff already, then it's just a function call to the log, right? But if they're not doing that, they'd have to write that, and that becomes maybe a feature even.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does make a lot of sense from that description. But I think a lot of times what happens though is product owners aren't the ones writing stories. BAs aren't the ones breaking stories down.
Mm-hmm.
The teams aren't necessarily pushing back even. So you end up seeing like 8 scenarios in the AC, and they find it hard to lift that over a sprint. And then they say, well, we're dev complete, but testing didn't get done. We'll just do it next sprint.
Yeah.
That unfortunately is, too common.
Yeah.
Right?
That happens. That's not an effect of really any of these estimation techniques. That's more an effect of like
poor discipline,
having a dysfunctional product, product and development relationship having issues, and that is that's something you can hopefully get help with. Hopefully your Scrum Master can ask for help with.
Absolutely.
Team members can ask for help. Have everyone ask for help on their own channels. Have the Scrum Master asks for help from whoever they work for, and the developers ask for help from whoever they work for, and see who gets it first.
There you go. Let us know. The comments below.
You let me know who gets what first.
Oh, I wanted to say something about flow metrics before we move away from there.
Flow metrics.
Yeah, we keep saying that, the number of stories per sprint, but in a Kanban model, the flow metrics work just as well. You don't have sprints, but you still have a time box, right? So in a Kanban model, the number of stories, you don't even have to estimate them. If you break them down to the smallest possible level, then the number of stories completed per unit of time could be a week, could be a day, whatever it is. It's up to the team to figure that out, right, or decide that.
Yeah.
But flow metrics are valid in either framework.
Well, they are valid because everywhere that I work, I try to establish whatever the team is doing. So any of these methods of estimation / forecasting are fine, whatever they use. But then I try to establish what I usually call a leadership level Kanban. I usually call leadership Kanban is what I call it. Again, air quotes leadership depends on what level in the organization you're aligned at, especially a product. But in product, in scaled product organizations, you're talking at the epic level. You're talking at a much higher level than the team level. So things start and go into the cycle of development and get the process started.
Right.
But they obviously don't finish. Most epics, I would say, don't finish in a sprint, a single sprint. Most companies' epics probably don't even finish in 2 sprints. I try 2-3 sprints at the most. I want my epics kind of zipping through development, and a lot of companies that I've worked at are not that way. Their epics are much longer time frames. That's fine. This podcast is not about that. That right. Probably deserves its own separate. The reason I say all that is because I will represent the movement, the slower movement of those higher level items that are summaries of larger portions of work. I'll put that on a organizational Kanban, a leadership level Kanban at a higher place in the hierarchy in the organization, so that people can have a dashboard they can look at that it gives them a very clear picture of these air quotes projects. I don't like using the word projects, but these initiatives, whatever it is, these business objectives, whatever they are in this state, and it's either not started, in progress, or done.
Done, right?
And that's it. That's all that is on that board, and that board should have a WIP limit. I would hope. I mean, maybe you could add like user feedback as a column to the which some people call that verify, but I wouldn't want to get verify confused with actual like our internal QA or whatever testing. But some people add a verify to that, which means they have to show it to users and get users feedback. That's what it really means. It means user verification is what that column means, and I would accept that. That would be 100% fine with me. But I really wouldn't accept a lot of other columns like in started testing, waiting for QA, begin QA, like waiting for deployment. I don't want any of those columns. I don't care about any of that. I don't care about any of that.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Certainly for the leadership Kanban or anything like that, you don't want all of those extraneous columns there. On the higher level, you just want the fewest possible columns that just show at the high level what these initiatives are doing, like new, in progress, done.
Yeah. The last thing that's on here it's in the no estimates. It's in the no estimates column. It's in the flow column, but it's not really flow. It's the last point on here, which is business value delivered. So it's in the last category for us, but it kind of is not part of the last category. It could live in any of these estimation categories because it's a separate field. So yep. Like maybe we talk about it as a separate field, but maybe we also talk about it as like not doing any of these estimation techniques and only assigning a business value. Because over time, your business value delivered would kind of replace. I would assume that you could get an average business value delivered every sprint, and that it wouldn't wildly go up and down.
Well, I mean,
maybe it would.
I was just going to challenge that, because what happens is it wouldn't go wildly up and down if the complexity is more or less constant, right, for the whole project. But it's not in real life.
Yeah.
So sometimes you deliver less business value. I guess what I'm saying is it should never be taken as a guarantee that because there's a certain average that the team is compelled to deliver to that average, right? It's more of a yardstick that says the team delivered thusly, and then when it's low, have a conversation. Why is it low?
Yeah.
That's the value to me in having that. But yeah, I'm a big fan of business value, especially when used in conjunction with some of these other things, because from the business perspective, they don't really care how many story points you deliver, right? They care about business value, and because they control that.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's something that we haven't hit on that in this whole podcast, unbelievably, in this hour-long podcast, which is none of these numbers are for anybody other than the team. Mm-hmm. This is just for the team. These numbers are totally inadequate to convey what your team's doing to anyone in the organization that is not sitting on your team. These numbers are only for your team to figure out how they can commit to things that they're about to work on and how they can forecast what they're going to work on in the near future. They become less relevant when you're talking about the far future, and they become completely irrelevant when you're breaking outside of the one individual team these numbers apply to, all of these categories.
That's right.
I mean, hours, maybe. You could make the argument like, well, hours kind of should be standard. I mean, yeah, they kind of should be standard, but when you start looking at the actual hours produced, so like what we were talking about before, you're going to find that some teams constantly go over their hour estimates. Some teams constantly go under their hour estimates. So even that is not going to work. But where you can tie all this together and you can communicate it at higher levels in the organization, business value. If you're tracking all this stuff for the team, but then you're tracking business value for the business or for the product group or for the executive level Kanban or whatever, that is something you can aggregate and communicate up.
I think you're right. I agree with you fully there. But I think it also completes the loop because the business value is ascribed by the business. So a product owner typically would assign business value to the work items, right? And then at the end of the sprint, it's the product owner who would essentially convey to the stakeholders that of X number of business value points, again, pick a scale, doesn't matter what the scale is, the team managed to deliver Y. And then the delta is what spurs a conversation, right? They ran into some headwinds because of X, Y, Z. That's the conversation. It's also telling the stakeholders that the team is doing the best they can, and when they fall short, this is why.
Yeah.
And that's all it is. It's never questioned why is it short, except that it spurs a conversation. So no guarantees, but business value is a much better indicator for the business. For the team, maybe not, but I'd say over time the team should get used to that as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I would think the job of the team there is to question when they're working on lower business value things, to question it. You know, at least they know to look out for like, hey, this is obviously not the most valuable thing that we could be working on, and to try to understand some of those lean concepts and try to engage to get the other side of the story, to get into the mindset of the product person, because like the product person doesn't have the monopoly on this stuff.
No, that's
right.
That's right.
Like the team should be engaged in talking to customers on a regular basis. So it benefits them to get into this mindset to be able to talk about business value. Whereas the other side of this is I hide the team from my customers, and then I'm now the gatekeeper of the customers, and like that. Yeah, I know. We're not gonna. We don't have enough time to go down this.
Sadly, that's actually very, very true. I think that some of the newer things help the team in that regard. Like, for example, having a sprint goal defined. That helps because at any point during the sprint, the team should be asking each other, is the work we're doing contributing towards moving the sprint goal or towards the goal? If it's not, let's not do it. Like refactoring, standing up environments. If it's not directly contributing to the sprint goal, I'm not saying environments aren't needed to be stood up, just that not the sprint maybe. So question that. And based on that, you could be closer aligned to what the goal is, right? With a hope to meet that goal at the end of the sprint.
Yeah, I like it. But I'm a big fan of business value. I think we should talk about how we can make an entire episode out of business value. I'm not sure how, but I am sure that we probably could propose enough new ideas to people on how to include business value in what they're doing that it might open some mental doors for some people who might not think about it,
Yeah, that is a great subject, and we can maybe even explore how business value could be used as a measure across a program, like multiple teams.
Yeah, that was a question that I wanted to dig into when you were talking. So business value, since it's set by the product people and the product organization, or maybe business, like in SAFE, the leadership /product/ leadership comes in and gives everything its business value in one day. It's basically one person across all the teams. So in that model, the business value basically is standardized between all the teams. So would you advocate business value being standardized? Unlike story points and all the rest of the stuff that we're talking about, business value, since coming from the product, be standardized.
I think if you have a program at play where you have multiple teams and you're trying to track in SAFE, they call it the efficiency of the train, right? The release train. Yeah. Then it makes sense, right? And SAFE arbitrarily picks a band. I think it's like 80-something% to 100. If the train is not delivering in that band, then it's inefficient, right? That's what they say.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to do something like that, it may make sense to standardize, but you have to look at whose vested interests are we serving? If the product organization owns the teams, like the work, right, then standardizing makes sense. But if you've got one product owner with a team here, maybe another team here, another product owner with that team there, that doesn't make sense to standardize because each product owner does things differently.
Yeah. If the product is split up between multiple different hierarchical organizations, the technical product is managed over here and business product is managed over here and legacy, whatever, in-house, internal, whatever product is managed over here, and they're all under
I would go back to my Boeing example there as well, right? It's product. Everything's a product, but each product is unique. So.
Yeah, but I like, as a manager in that organization or as a senior member of that organization, I would kind of push product to have a community interest or something where they can talk about how they align. I kind of think the business value should be a metric that sort of aligns. I also don't know what scale to use, like 1 through 5, 1 through 7.
It really doesn't matter.
It doesn't really matter.
As long as it's consistent. Especially if you're standardizing, it makes sense to make it the same. So, I mean, most commonly 1 to 10, right?
Yeah.
But that might be too granular. What's a 6 versus a 7?
Yeah.
You don't want to get into those kinds of discussions necessarily.
As a product person, I don't want to get into any discussions. I'm absolutely against discussions, and I think it's time we end this discussion.
All right. Well, thank both of you who hung in with us this far. So thank you.
Speaking of waste of time, estimation. That would have been the greatest intro to this podcast ever. Speaking of wasting time, we're going to talk about estimation.
Oh my goodness, that would have been awesome.